All right, today is
That's me, sorry about that.
Thursday, July 11th, and this is our regularly scheduled Finance Committee meeting. I'm calling this meeting to order. Item 2 are those present, and right now I see Counselor Shoup, myself, and Counselor Cushing, so we're all here and with town staff. Item 3 is approval of minutes from our July 13th, 2024 meeting. Can I get a motion?
Second.
Any discussion? No, all those in favor? All right. It's approved. Item number 4 is discussion and possible action on recommended language from staff on the fund balance policy. So this is, at our last meeting, we had discussed potentially revisiting our fund balance policy. And I think we, at the meeting, generally agreed to keep the policy itself the same, but make sure that we added language that expressed the intent to try and get to that 16.6 target in the future, as well as to clear up any concerns perhaps about, what happens if we have to use the fund balance in certain situations. And so staff put together something, it's in our packet for us to
Would you mind sharing that?
look at and discuss.
Yeah, as Liam brings it up, I'll just speak. I think perhaps we went a bit further than your directive, but I suspect you'll like what we've done. You might recall one of the confusing things of this part of the policy is that it references 2 different metrics: unassigned fund balance and unrestricted. And so this set of changes focuses only on unassigned, which is the more conservative of the 2. We've also taken the liberty of of raising the lower limit from 8.33 to 10. And then set the aspirational goal of 16.6. And I say aspirational because unlike now, which says once it gets to certain thresholds, certain things happen. This gives the council some discretion if it wishes to use it. But it does clearly, by way of policy, set the expectation is that being our goal.
Mm-hmm. So any thoughts or feedback from the counselors on what what staff has kind of put forward?
No, sorry. I don't know if this is common. I know it was actually me who was expressing concern about it. I don't know if it's like excessive. I don't know if other people will do it. I just felt like it takes a little bit of the pressure off of us, where if we're getting up there, we can just be like, well, that's our policy.
Yeah.
Was kind of my thinking, but I really don't know, like Tom and Norm, if this is actually normal. I mean, I think Joe suggested it, but I don't think he elaborated.
So in my research for coming up with the changes, I did look at several towns around the area in Maine. A lot of them have the 2 months expenditures policy, the 16.67. Not a single town that I looked at made reference to unrestricted fund balance.
Mm-hmm.
And the second reason that I felt like it was a good idea to take it out was when you talk about unrestricted fund balance, you bring in committed and assigned. So in almost every scenario, you should have a higher balance when you combine those 3 categories. And as Tom said, unassigned, it would be the most conservative approach. And then to recall back in the budget process, the spreadsheet that I showed you guys when we were talking about fund balance, we were kind of projecting that we would be in the 12% range in fiscal 25. So that was the thought behind stopping at 10 as the floor, to give us some room so that we don't jeopardize ourselves in case something unexpected in the next year or so, and we force ourselves out of compliance immediately after making a change that we think is good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Counselor, to your point, and I think Joe Kutera provided some kind of regional context, Greater Portland. My recollection is, though, many of them have aspirations in that 16, and there are a couple of folks, Falmouth comes to mind, that are actually approaching or above 20%, which seems extreme to me, frankly.
Yeah.
Many are kind of packed in that low teens, 10 to 12 to 14 or so. So to answer your question, I don't think this is abnormal. And I think the thing to keep in mind, this is really about being mindful of what the bonding rating agencies are interested in. Moody's in particular highly values fund balance. And their stated preference is kind of 2 months worth, that's 16. So I think, and the other thing we've done, I think that will impress them is that we've raised our floor, right? We're trying to get better every year. So I think this will be met very, very favorably by the bonding agencies. I still hear some reverberation somewhere. Or is it just me?
Not me this time.
Your mic's sensitive.
Yeah. It's you.
Nelson Jones.
Yep.
So, you say aspirational, we get there when we have a budget surplus and we put that money in the bank. We get there when Nick's, returns and refunds account has more money in it.
Yeah.
Than
Not fully
we
used.
needed to give out, is that, so there isn't, so the way this is accumulated is really by having a surplus in the budget. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's budget performance, so it's either not spending all the money that we were provided for whatever reason, and that happens, and or exceeding revenue projections, again, realizing more money than we expected. As we get better and tighter on our budgets, the frequency and the amount of kind of those differences, change over time. But things do happen. And then the other one is, as you mentioned, the overlay is certainly an area where oftentimes we'll overestimate what we need to settle any abatement requests. So this is not something you budget for. It's really something that happens. And one of the challenges is you can't move this needle very quickly overnight. And for good reason, because arguably we're raising more money through taxation than we need to support operations.
I have a question, because I know we have other parts of our fiscal policy that talk specifically to like creating reserves for capital. Does that count as part of the unassigned?
No.
Or that would be an assigned?
That would be an assigned.
Okay. Because I think that's the piece that I know we also have a policy that we want to get to a certain dollar amount eventually, which I don't think we're close to. But that's like to support capital.
And I recall way back, is this me?
It might be you.
What? Well, I don't have anything on here, so.
Just,
Which is fine.
just push your mic back a bit.
I sound good with Reaper. Going way back to, I think, our early agenda item, which we never got to, was sort of taking a look at the entire financial policy. And one of the things that stood out for me was the phrase, "we will maintain an optimal bond rating." And so it feels to me like these two things in part go hand in hand, because a lot of the discussion we've had about whether we should spend it down or up and so forth talks about, well, what's the effect on the bond rating?
Mhm.
And so I wonder, optimal is, like what's cold to an Eskimo. I mean, it's, so I'm wondering if we can't put a little more flesh on that bone without losing too much flexibility.
Well, optimal in its purest form would be to have the highest bond rating that's possible, right? And so for S&P, Standard & Poor's, I believe we're one step below the highest. For Moody's, I believe we're 3 steps below. And our financial advisors has advised us that with each rung we climb, we would save about 10 basis points. So, that's real money, and I don't mean to dismiss it, but for us, frankly, to impress Moody's and based on fund balance, to achieve a higher bond rating, there's going to be a fair amount of pain associated to get to that with reward, but a somewhat limited
I
reward.
guess, so another way of saying is we're happy with our bond rating now. We wouldn't want to go lower.
And that's the thing that I want to make sure. I've always focused on, let's make sure that we don't slide, because the closer you get to the top, the harder it is to get those final pieces. And I'm very comfortable.
So what's the downside to saying, what is our rating now? A plus, A?
We're double A
Double A,
and we're small A1.
double A, small A1.
Yeah.
So is there a downside to kind of saying that our goal is to stay there and and go higher if it makes sense? Because that's what I hear you saying, is that you're right. We could, go to 20% and then, it sort of begs love you if, they're 100% secure.
So, yeah, on the scale of ratings, triple B is the lowest investment grade rating. So we are high investment grade rated bonds. And that's something to be very proud of. So, optimal may be the right word at this point because we're in the high category.
Well, it means a lot to me after layers of explanation.
Yeah.
When I pick it up and read it, and I
Mhm.
think to whoever occupies the seat next and so forth, I'm just having trouble wrapping my head around what's the problem with saying we want to be investment grade in the A category. Is that a?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like that's what this metric would kind of, by saying we aspire to be at 16.67, I think what that says, I think, to the bond rating agencies is while we're in a good place, we aspire to be better if we can. And the other piece, when I look at this, I'm not just thinking of the one metric, which this is one metric that they care about, but they also care about our debt and how much debt we have. And if we know our debt's gonna go up because a school, a community center, whatever in the future, influencing this metric today may help to offset
Mhm.
those metrics that we also know are gonna change. And even for our valuation, which is a big metric that they look at.
I get that.
Yeah.
Okay, what I'm at, so, and you're further underscoring my point, because what happens is multiple things go into this rating.
Yeah,
And that when you use the term optimize or optimal, what you're suggesting is that you're going to try to balance those issues out. But what you're not saying is to what end. Okay.
Yeah.
So for example, you could say we optimized it to investment grade B, and there'd be nothing in the policy that speaks to whether that's good, bad, or indifferent.
Mhm.
I don't think I'd be your town manager anymore if that's was the outcome. Counselor, I think what you're speaking to is another section in the policy.
Yeah.
I think that people seem to be comfortable with ambiguity in this case, and I don't understand why, but I don't want to spend the rest of the meeting on it.
But to your point, I think you're speaking to another section in the policy. And I don't disagree with,
Yes, I am, because they are related.
certainly,
And so, we're not functioning here in a vacuum.
no.
And it seems like since all of the discussion that we've had about whether we should spend balance,
Mhm.
whether we should increase balance, we have our investment guy here, because our entire conversation is about what's our bond rating going to be. Okay,
Yep.
that was what the public was asking us. So again, it's.
So Counselor, what is your recommendation or solution? I
My
hear what you're saying.
recommendation is to say that we should be, as Norm says, we should be maintaining investment grade bonding at A something or better. Great. So, and what happens is if you can't do that,
Mhm.
then that triggers an explanation of why.
So are you suggesting we modify the language in that first sentence to say we aspire to maintain a bond rating of where we're at or better? And in order to do that, we aspire to have a 16.67% goal for this fund
Yeah.
balance as a means to.
Yeah, that would do it. And
Yeah.
then when we get to doing a complete review of the policy, we can bring those things into
Yeah.
line. Okay.
Because there's another piece of our policy that has the metrics, I think, that are
Yes.
all inclusive of it. So I think that's where we can revisit those two. Sorry.
Question is gonna be the same one always. Do other towns do that? That seems a little bold to be like, we want to maintain this. Why don't we want the top? Why don't we want to be the top? That's my question
None of the
immediately.
towns in Maine,
Right.
that I researched made any mention of a bond rating in their fund balance policy.
Mhm.
Yeah, in fact, our advisor said that this is the most elaborate and comprehensive fiscal policy that he has ever had association with. So that's on one hand, something to be proud of, but it also comes with some
My
responsibility.
understanding is our financial policy gives the implication that we are going for the highest bond rating. We don't need to say it. That's
Yeah,
because we have such an
I
impactful and
think,
in-depth
yeah.
one. Obviously, we are taking it seriously and our goal is to be the top.
Yeah.
But to actually say that, I don't know. That makes me nervous. I
Okay.
think that makes me
Let me
nervous
ask
for
you a
you
question a
guys.
different way. Is the intent to actually do a cover-to-cover review of the policy? Because this is just, one part, small part, important nonetheless.
That was actually the first agenda item on the financial policy. It's the only reason that I know to raise this issue is
Mhm.
because I read the whole thing.
Right.
And I thought in general it was pretty good, but that one stood out to me saying, well, what does that mean?
Mhm.
And
So, John, I know there was a lot of interest in this particular matter, that came out of the budget process, and so on and so forth. Is the preference to move forward to council with this change, this very specific change, or to hold this thought, take the time to look and provide a comprehensive, set of changes to the whole policy?
I would be okay if that's what you guys want to do continue to work at other parts of the policy and say, but I would like to lock in and say, we want to keep this as part of that
Okay.
and then keep going through the policy. My personal opinion is I'm generally fine with what's in this. I don't see the language we've added, super controversial. I see it just as saying like, hey, we have a goal. We want to do better than where we're at. But we're holding essentially to our current policy that was in here before with some adjustments. The only piece that gives me pause based on what staff recommended was changing the excess above 10 from 12% to 10%. So it was 12% before. And if we were serious about trying to get to 16.67%, I feel like we should keep it at 12% and not go down to 10%. So I'm interested to hear why you guys made that
But
suggestion.
rather than three metrics.
different numbers in there?
8.23,
Yeah.
10 and 12,
Yeah.
we said, let's go to 10 and 16.
Yeah.
So that was the
Keep the
simple thought
metric
behind it.
simple, give council some leeway to take action within the policy. And put the words in there that say, you don't have to do it, you may. So there's
Mhm.
the opportunity, should council have the appetite to do it, but you don't have to.
So for instance, that same language, it's the paragraph under the sea of red there. It used to say 12, once any excess above 12% must.
Yeah.
So this gives you some flexibility should you choose to use it.
And the council would have to act through the budget or something if they wanted to.
Most likely be through the budget process if you wanted to fund, retire more debt or
Mhm.
fund reserve accounts or what have you.
So what is your guys' reaction to that? The going from 12 to 10 must to may? Does that feel
yeah.
comfortable, appropriate?
So there are two questions. One, I'm completely comfortable with what's here. And I don't feel any need to modify this today to go back to address the other issue. But I just want to put down a marker that says that per some regulation, we're supposed to review this policy periodically.
Mhm.
And when we do, I would like to address the issue of bond rating and what does it mean? What does optimizing it mean?
Mhm.
Okay.
Counselor Shoup?
I think I missed that last conversation because I guess I'm wondering why the budget, any excess above, you're saying we're going from 12 down to 10. And you're
Mhm.
saying that will help us in our policy and that's good, even though that seems like a lower threshold.
I think the may helps us because now instead of saying must use
Right.
it, we're saying may, but again, like that's where I kind of thought keeping it at the 12%. Essentially, what we're saying with this policy is at a minimum, the town must be at 10%.
Yep.
If the town was between 10 and 16.6, then the council has some discretion on whether
Mhm.
they would want to use fund balance for any of those purposes. Or they may not. And so the question is do we want to is that 10 to 12 substantial in terms of making that adjustment, or do we want to keep it at the 12% of when you have discretion?
Right.
You know, it's not forcing any action on you in that range from
Right.
10 to 16 point. It's there if you want to do it, but it's not forcing you to do it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, it-
we could end up with a council in 5 years who are like, screw this policy, let's use up everything and keep
Sure.
10% minimum, and I don't think that's our goal
Yeah,
today as a
But-
council, and I
but-
think that's the concern.
Well, you're right, a future council can toss this aside and do whatever
That's
they
where
want.
I'm going, at a minimum, maybe we can keep it 12 to give. a little less- I
yeah.
don't know.
I,
That-
I,
Whether you go 10 or 12 is your choice. I will say that we are just above 12 and our projections are that we're going to maintain that. But we're setting the bar, the floor, just below where we're at. And, you know, you can make your own judgment on that. What I would say is that you should change must to may,
Yeah.
because the reality is when it's must, we'll never get to 16.
Yeah.
Right? Whenever it hits that trigger, there's other uses of the fund. And so if that's our aspiration, you need to have the flexibility.
I mean, my take is if we're serious about getting to 16, then we should leave it at 12 because we don't want to be anywhere near 10 anyways. I don't know.
I agree with that. Are you okay with that?
I'm okay with it, but conceptually, what the floor means to me is that in a business, we would say, how much working capital do you need? And there are metrics, it could be 2 months revenue, that sort of thing. So you're saying this is 1.2, it's.
It's 1.5 almost. Yeah.
Roughly, one and
The 12 is 1.5.
12 is 1.5,
Yeah.
and
So 10 would be.
10 is
like 1.25.
1.2.
Yeah.
And so, again, that is kind of a place that says, when you think about our emergency, it's never going to happen all in 1 month, but how much running room do we have if we have an emergency? That really is where that floor sits to me. And so if 10 is within standard, I'm fine with it. If others feel like 12, it makes you feel better, it's okay with me. I just want to make sure
It's
I'm.
a big leap. You're moving your floor by almost 4%.
Not the floor. So the floor stays at 10%, right?
Getting that middle metric as well. 10, 12, and 16.
Yeah,
Yep.
But I mean, realistically, a future council could change that anyway,
Yeah.
so.
yeah.
I mean,
But we're the ones here right
how
now.
we want that.
Yeah, yeah.
Be retired by then.
Remember, the likelihood of ever needing this, the emergency situation,
Yeah.
you know, it's not inconceivable, but it's fairly remote, right? It's
Yeah.
a situation where, you know, our tax base has been decimated. We're not able to bill, we're not able to collect revenue. We need things just to keep the lights on and the fire trucks running. So it's certainly good practice to think for that, but the likelihood of that kind of
Mhm.
very disastrous situation is slim to none. So I think this conversation really is around maintaining bond rating and satisfying what they think is important.
So I would like to move that we accept staff's recommendation with the exception of making that any excess above 12% may be assigned by any combination to one of the following subsequent language. Can I get a second? Any other discussion on this? All those in favor? All right, so what we'll do is we'll kind of keep this
Yep.
going, and then maybe we can prioritize which other parts of the policy we need to look at. I don't know if town staff, I know in parts of our policy, they say some parts we need to look at annually, some we need to look at every 2 years. So maybe if you guys can direct us as we plan the next meeting, if there's a specific one we need to look at first, then
Sure.
maybe we can prioritize. If any counselor has a specific thing in the broad policy that they want to discuss at the next meeting, we can look at those. So like your specific item, we can make that an agenda item for discussion if we want.
Yeah, I'd like to take a look and take a stab at providing some language to Councilor Cushing's point. And if you like, we can provide a suggested kind of roadmap in terms of how to tackle this, kind of eat this elephant one
Yep.
by one time.
Perfect. That'd be great. All right, so next is item 5. And again, these are items that I'm not looking for necessarily solutions today, but more for us just to align on how we want to approach tackling, similar to what Tom just said. How do we want to tackle some of these big things that are pretty big in scope and make sure that we're aligned? And really just kind of get the conversation going, and then hopefully staff can come back with a recommended plan of how we would approach each of these three items. So the first one is we established a goal this year to establish a multi-year capital facilities prioritization list representing investment needs of 5 million or more over the next 20 years. So that was a goal that we were assigned as part of the goal setting that we haven't gotten to. And so I just wanted to have the conversation to say, with this goal in mind, what do we want to do? How do we want to do it? What can we reasonably get through this year on this goal to help move it forward? So with that, I'm just opening it up for discussion. And if staff has thoughts or ideas on how you think we should approach it, please let us know.
I want to come back to that notion of the two different types of capital expenditures. There's one are developmental, big change things and so forth. The others are, I guess I would say, in the category of keeping the act sharp, of making sure that we're not allowing our assets to depreciate in a way that we get so far behind that we have to go back to the taxpayers and say, I think this has happened here before. The floor just fell out of the town hall or something of that nature. So that capital planning comes into line with getting some sense of what our facilities needs are going to be over time. I'm assuming roads have something to do with that. Is that fit in that category?
Well, it's potentially a gray area, I suppose, right? I mean, I think what you're talking about is new investments as opposed to kind of maintenance.
Yeah, I think that's kind of it. And there are some things that, when I think about, employing, in the next few years, maybe the next few weeks, we're going to have massive changes in terms of tech and the ability to utilize that tech in tons of ways that should gain us some efficiencies if we make some investments and follow that curve. I'm not sure, and we already have computer systems. So are we maintaining them? Are we upgrading them? What are, we're always going to need to do accounting. So that's kind of the sort of the sense of getting some clarity around what exactly we're talking, what are the categories of things that we are talking about, so that when we explain them to the public, they might understand.
I would say if we're reading this at face value for what it is, it's capital facilities over $5 million. So I assume that's more like the new school, the community center,
Okay.
all the things in the parks and facilities master plan that exists today.
Above that threshold.
Yeah, we have a 2016 facilities plan that maybe needs to get pulled out for this to see what's still relevant. So I feel like we have like some things that fall into this scope. The pieces that aren't in this scope that I think could fall into the 5 million category, but we won't know for this council, I don't think, is the vulnerability assessment. There's major infrastructure. And for the transportation study, if we want to say some of those major transportation projects are going to be the one in our, for impact fees we're looking at is like $20 million. So those are pretty big things. So to me, though, those are currently out of scope as this goal is framed. And maybe that's something, if we can get through facilities and $5 million plus facilities first, then we can say, what about other major investments? I think we should keep maintenance stuff out of scope for this, just because to me, that's part of more of our CIP operating budget. These are like those big investments that we need to be looking at. So that way, hopefully we can better plan and time those things so that we're not seeing huge surges in taxes. But we always typically have a $6 million CIP, right, for maintenance and some big projects, but these are like the things that are really the anomalies that come in that we need to plan and prioritize.
And I look at this as more of like letting the voters know what's coming.
Yeah.
So it's not shocking. People were shocked that we needed new primary schools. I'm like, where have you been? And I think that's what this is, to me, this is a big tool to educate voters
Yeah.
and the residents about like what's coming down the line. And so they're not completely surprised and they understand like where we are as a town. I think some people were really surprised, like, we don't even have a community center, like, so like, that should be top on the list. And, we need a new school. And I think to me, that's how I look at it, is brand new things that to let people know this is coming down the line, this is gonna happen, we need it. I think it's easier and more palatable for people to do maintenance and things like that. So I think that would kind of skew it a little bit. Where to me, I'm like, we gotta let them know this is coming, so we're not
Mhm.
getting slammed with questions, how come we didn't know this was happening, and things like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, having line of sight for all of us makes perfect sense. I'm not so naive to think that this won't be controversial because, when you ask us to identify the project and then place it on a timeline, there'll be, I'll say winners and losers. Some will say, why is that first? And so it's an important planning exercise, but make no mistake, it will be politicized as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's an important part of the process that we should plan for is like, there might be a list, and maybe before we offer a prioritization, we have a public meeting to say we have a list, we'd like feedback, and then from that feedback, we make a list. But I liked what you guys did in the past facilities plan where it was like near term, midterm, long term. So it's less about which one and when, it's more like, we know we want these in the next 5 years. These ones might be 5 to 10 and these ones are 10 plus. And that's just to help keep things in context where, again, even when I was looking at the last master facilities plan, the community center was in the category that could be done by like 2035. And so
Yep.
technically, according to that plan, if we waited a little bit longer, we're still within the scope of that original plan. And so I almost see us kind of taking that old plan, updating it with whatever's new that wasn't known then and saying, what does the new look like? Like, do
Yep.
we want to put the community center in the less than 5 years view, which would be sooner than what the current master plan says?
Yeah, and then things will happen, right? Crises will demand change of priorities. Opportunities will do the same, that we've got a partner to do this project sooner than we expected.
Mhm.
Um,
But I do think the public wants to hear, like, there's been that comment of like, well, what's the priority? What's happening when? And I think what this process will hopefully help is at least have something that we can say, this is what we approve right now. Again, subject to change, subject to other councils, but having an updated plan, I think would be helpful.
Are you okay if our first pass is in kind of those buckets, if you will, kind of range it, near term, medium, long term? And then I think it's really the council needs to be engaged and assist us in setting those priorities in terms of what's first.
Yeah.
Second, third.
Yeah, and I think that's where, again, depending on how we want to approach this, right? Like, I don't think we have to rush and do it just at this committee level. What I was thinking was, first we have to establish the list, right?
Mhm.
Then we maybe need to come up with some criteria through how we prioritize. We could draft a recommendation, or we could go out to the public and say, here's a list, here are some priorities that you guys tell us so that we can draft a recommendation. I think it's important once we have a recommendation either from the committee or the council or the public, that we do apply it to the long-term financial model that we have to say, well, what does this really mean financially? Just to show, are we seeing surges in taxes in certain years based on timing, and how does that impact where we want things to be? Maybe we have to move things around a little bit. But ultimately, I would like to see something that goes to the council that's been vetted through the public, that, we can say, yep, that's kind of our current approved plan. And then I think there needs to be a discussion on maintenance of that, right? Like, how often does that get revisited? Is it every 5 years, every 2 years? What does that look like? Just to kind of make it a continuous process, because I think, like you said, Tom,
Mhm.
things change. priorities change, and so making sure that at some point the council, and this could be something that's documented in policy, in the fiscal policy, like takes a moment to kind of revisit that formally and make updates. So I don't know if this is gonna be something we'll get done, like, I don't know if we'll get all of that done with this council and this finance committee. I don't think we need to, but I'd be curious to see staff kind of outline
Mhm.
what we think is a good public process as well, that gets us the opportunity to say, we have a refreshed list with some relative prioritization that we all agree is kind of what we would jointly communicate to the public. This goes back to some of the conversation we had yesterday in the comms committee. Like, this gives us a list that we can endorse, and then we can all speak and say, well, this is our current view on capital priorities.
Makes sense to me. In addition to school, community center, library, can you give me some other examples of things that might go on that list?
I can't think of too many. Public safety should be in very good shape for the next 20 years, plus years. I'll have to talk to our colleagues at the school. There may be other major capital needs that I'm just not aware of. And frankly, putting a roof on a high school, might exceed 5 million. That might be something is maintenance, but is significant enough that we ought to just be aware of it.
Yeah.
We'll reach out to Todd Jepson and certainly get him engaged. But on the town side, I think you list the three that have been circulating for 5 years now.
There was some stuff in the old plan about the North Scarborough Fire Station needing a major expansion or something. I don't know if that's still.
Yeah, the new fire chief and his command staff are really kind of rethinking all of that. And so,
Okay.
though that was true under Chief Thurlow, I'm not so sure that would be the same. I think maybe some consolidation or regional cooperation. North Scarborough is perfectly suited for collaboration with Gorham and Westbrook, because those areas, it's kind of at the corner. So, that will be our starting point to look back at that. An ice rink was in conversation back then. I haven't really heard it talked about much since. So I don't know that will be a town initiative. That was really driven by a citizen group. And we're looking to help support them by way of land and other things. But
Are there major items in the Parks and Facilities Master Plan that would exceed 5 million?
I'm sure there are. There's certainly a need for field development, additional fields. And I think if you do it kind of in a complex kind of concept, I think that could very easily exceed those sorts of monies.
That was what was in that last plan. It looked like there was an intent of looking at Warren Woods as a potential place for.
Yeah, we had reserved 8 acres of those 165. That reservation expired after 3 years. So
Bummer. Okay.
we may be able to talk to the land trust, have broached the issue with Andrew that he wasn't even aware of it, frankly.
Yeah.
There's some other parcels that, fair enough, but that's another need. We'll look at that plan. That's fresh, that's new, and Herd Park needs attention. I don't think that would ever exceed the $5 million threshold, but while we're doing this, we may just categorize some other kind of high ticket things, though they may be below the 5. I just think while we're made aware, we might as well capture them in the conversation.
I think it's important to look at like a lot of little things may add up to some big things. So maybe not to like keep the 5 million as a barometer, but like if you think, especially on the town side, if there are significant investments that need to happen that again create a threshold that again could essentially push out some big projects, or we may need to look how we time things. Like I think just knowing that may help.
Okay.
Is cameras on the street signs on that list, or on the traffic cameras? I think I asked that question because I thought we must have them, but apparently we don't. Is that something that's?
Cameras on signals?
Yeah.
We do now. Everyone has one. And it's been largely funded by private development.
Oh, okay.
Just in the last 2 weeks, frankly, that system is now up and running and in so-called learning mode. So it will, for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, it will learn and observe and start to learn the patterns before it goes live.
I spoke to it just the other day.
When-
Hoping that it would learn from me.
The other day I went all the way down Route 1.
It doesn't react well to hand gestures.
Neither did the people behind me.
The open space plan is planned to be done this year, right? So that might not be ready. And then the vulnerability assessment, when is that scheduled to be?
It's on the same timeline,
Okay,
springish, early
Yeah.
summer next year.
I think those are out of scope for this, but I think those could, again, my assumption is the transportation study, the vulnerability assessment, the open space.
Yeah,
plan.
Vulnerability, I don't know what to expect. I think there could be a big shock and big price tags associated with doing what should be done.
Yeah, so that's something maybe next year.
Not this paving the street, it's
Yeah.
raising it 4 feet.
Yeah,
That's it.
so I think that's a big thing that we might need to, once we know the results of those two studies at least. I don't know if the open space plan is gonna impact.
I mean, they're just gonna say you need like $26 million
Yeah.
to reach your 30 by 30 goal,
Yeah,
so.
but it might be like,
Yeah.
but to your point, if we're assuming 6 million, assuming the council approves putting 6 million to bond, and we need 26, like, when is the next 6? When is the next 6? And how is that prioritized relative to these other things? Cause that could move stuff around again. So I think I don't want to lose sight of those, but I want to be sure to the goal that we got, which is around facilities to get us focused, and then we can pull in other stuff later.
Excellent point. You could expect over the next 20 years to probably have 2 or 3 more asks of similar size, frankly. And the land's only gonna get more expensive.
It's true.
There are opportunities, as long as we're thinking big on the expense side, and there are opportunities anywhere in our future for enhancing our revenues that would be allowed by the state, capitalizing on our tourism or any of that kind of thing.
Local option sales tax would be wonderful for us, but that is never survived, and it's been it is a perennial discussion almost in every session. It's a constitutional issue that currently not allowed. But a community like Scarborough that maintains a pretty robust retail sector, I forget the numbers, I think over $800 million in retail sales in Scarborough last year.
Well,
Just
it's very interesting.
1% of that would be notable.
Right, because a huge, particularly in this season, there's a huge amount of our facilities are being used by folks from away who get the benefit of our
Mhm.
tax dollars. And I'll just raise this because I don't know what any other forum to raise it in, but when I think about funding schools, for example, my understanding is Massachusetts takes a piece of their sales tax or is a dedicated piece. And for the whole state, they build a fund. So instead of adding, doubling the cost in interest over a period of time, they take the money out of sales tax in a tourism-driven state and they put it in the bank. Now, obviously, we can't control that here, but you're having conversations all the time with people from the Maine Municipal Association and GP-COG and Stacy and all of those other people. And it strikes me, I raise this point because we are really heading to a crisis here with the aging of our population. And it's not that, the old people have been getting a really bad rap lately. But it's not that folks don't support education, et cetera, et cetera. It's that over time, it is the property tax is the most regressive way to raise those funds. And there's a point in time where people, and I'm sensing that we're near that point in time, where people just raise their hands and they say, enough of this. And, it may always not sound pretty irrational and so forth, but the underlying facts are that the burden of educating our children is disproportionately placed on people on fixed incomes. So anyway, so
No, I think
as
that's
we're
an
thinking in the
important-
long term, I just want to kind of say,
Yeah.
we really should be thinking about that along with every other municipality, because it's not like the options, the opportunity to get the cash is not there. It's just we're not using it.
Absolutely. I just, since I run the numbers every year and send them to Tom with a little tear in my eye about how we don't have access to these funds. I do think it is up to us and MMA to not necessarily go for the whole shebang, which is change the Constitution, give us a local sales tax, but to say, you're starving us and we're providing all of those taxes. You can reallocate how you do revenue sharing.
Yeah.
You can up revenue sharing, you can dedicate, pockets to what you're talking about, either school or infrastructure or all of these things. And there's many cases that could be made for us to really lay down, our hand and say, we're paying for a lot of development
Yeah.
that is regional based. So help us out.
And to put a finer point to that, I think something in the order of $80 million in sales tax was paid out of Scarborough.
Yep.
Consumers that did business in Scarborough to the state. In return, through revenue sharing, we got just over $3 million this year. And that's a combination of both sales tax revenue and income tax.
Yeah.
So
And so-
there's a huge disproportionate,
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's
If
a
we could get the
redistribution of
A long time ago, when that happened, I believe it was the king. And people threw the tea over the side of the ship. I mean, it's fundamentally the same issue.
I would predict a tax revolt of sorts is going to be what
Well,
ultimately
I
changes
like
things.
Karen's suggestion, right? Like, I feel like in Scarborough, I feel like we're leaders right now in addressing the housing crisis and conservation and climate change. Climate change, maybe we're a little behind, but conservation, we're trying to lead that charge, which is important at the state level. If we're doing that, why aren't we getting rewarded with more revenues? And so I don't know, is that our state legislatures that we need to be going to and saying, hey, you guys, you want more housing? Make
Right.
sure the people who are participating in that are getting more revenue so that we can address our roads, address our schools, because right now we're being forced to put it on the backs of people on fixed income, and that's not fair either. So how can we make it more fair?
So I think Tom and I are happy to share with you where the numbers are, at least for sales tax. I've never been able to get income tax figures that's generated from Scarborough. I've never been able to get
Mhm.
that from the state, but just haven't asked the right person, I guess.
The
But-
reason
I'd like to
these
share
things
those
never gain
numbers.
traction in the legislature, it's a function of numbers, right? I can tell you I grew up in northern Maine. I worked 10 years up in Midcoast, Maine. For the rest of the state to hear us cry about our inability, taxation and our inability to do this or that,
Mhm.
people just scoff at it and say, you're kidding me, because they're so destitute.
Yeah,
And so
But there's a lot, there's some gray area for very specific purposes, I feel.
the state could certainly share more with us than they do.
I mean, I think
That's
it's,
the angle we should
if it's
pursue.
based on valuation only, then yes, we were not gonna get much, but again, I go back to, if the state wants to incentivize towns to do certain things, they should reward
Right.
the towns that are doing certain things with more revenue.
Hmm.
And to me, like, especially when we think of housing, which is a crisis statewide, and we are a big contributor to the solution, yet the reward is our taxpayers are having to pay to fix our roads and having to pay to fix our
Right.
schools, like, just doesn't feel balanced to me. And so I think we're getting a little bit off topic.
It's all related though.
But yeah, but so the only other thing I would like to add as staff kind of thinks through like what that plan and process looks like for this is I just want to make sure that we include the school. Tom, you had already mentioned Todd Jepson,
Mhm.
getting him involved. Making sure that the library is involved, because the library expansion is going to be one of those projects on this list that we need to kind of align on. And again, just for me, what's important is we think through like the right ways to include the public in this conversation, because to your point,
Mhm.
it's not going to be a solution that everybody's going to be happy with, but it has to be a solution that we all feel like went through at least a fair process to kind of get to how we got to what the plan is. And so I just want to make sure that we're thinking, how can we do that to get the recommendation out?
Mhm.
Any other thoughts on, okay, so again, my ask would be with this discussion, if staff could come back and say what seems like a reasonable plan for what we can get done for the remainder of this year, which again, may not be everything we talked about, but at least advances the process. Next discussion is TIF CEA policy. So again, we had a goal to review and update CEA policy to align with council goals regarding expenditures, growth, and housing options. And so I think what we need to align on again is like, what does this mean? What's the scope? What are we trying to do? What started this, from what I recall, was a couple of things. One was when we were reviewing the CEA for the 3i Home project, it came up, why aren't we using our TIF policy? And it's really out of scope for that particular policy because it's an affordable housing CEA, not a economic CEA from an economic TIF district. And so that kind of led to the conversation of, well, should we have a separate affordable housing policy, or can we update the existing one to be inclusive of what we do for affordable housing? And then also we were in the midst of the school and we were talking about potentially changing the TIF boundary for the existing downtown development TIF. And so we said we would pick that up later. And so that's another topic of, do we want to change the boundary as well? The piece that we didn't talk about that formulated this goal, but is a piece that I think we need to revisit as a committee, is this year, my understanding was it was a bit of a challenge to allocate all of the TIF funds to qualified projects, which means what we're capturing, we may be over capturing, or we may be in a position to be over capturing soon. So instead of shielding 100%, we may have to move it to like 70%, 50%. I don't know what the number is, but we're in a position where we probably need to start having that conversation to see if there is suggestions we need to make. And again, that's a long process, right? To go back to the state to change things. And so we do need to start that conversation sooner rather than later. So those were the things that I was thinking of when I saw this goal. And I don't know if those are the right things. The other piece was, I see you, Karen, shaking your head, so reminded me of the housing financial piece was your model, which I think we've kind of already addressed. But what we didn't get to was really sitting with you and looking at the Downs TIF,
Sure.
which was an important piece that just got put aside because we had to start budget. So I would like us to, at some point, be able to look at that with you and really align. I did have a conversation with Peter Mishu, who said that the Downs is willing to potentially come in the future to the council meeting, even though they're no longer obligated, where I think we could, maybe that's part of the presentation, is your assessment of where we are, what the value is at this point. So I don't want to lose sight that that's an important thing. If we don't do that with them, then, still figuring out how to bring that to council and more publicly put out the model and the Downs TIF.
Wow, so there's a lot there.
Yeah, so, but all of those things come to mind. And so each of them may not need to happen tomorrow, but what's the priority? How do we want to tackle it? What do you guys think is most important? So that way we can start to chip away at all of those things.
If it's helpful, I can certainly go through our experience with the policy over the last few years. And then I think we've got some simple suggestions that could be made. Doesn't address all the things that you're talking about, but it addresses sort of the operational aspects of the TIF policy, if you'd like me to sort of walk you through that.
Yeah, do you guys want to hear that, or do you want to focus on?
I'm not sure. I do want to hear it. I'm not sure I want to hear it now. It feels to me like, we might get to a lot of this stuff if we just did a thorough review of the Downs project. Where is it at today? Where is it trending? How is it benefiting our community? I listened to a guy come in the public comment the other day, and to my mind, 90% of what he was saying was sort of fantasy based on my understanding. And I'm not criticizing him for that. I'm just simply saying that there is a hard and fast perception out there that this is a bad deal. And I haven't seen anything to suggest that, but it feels to me like we've had enough space between the um, the school and the location and so forth, that we've had a deep breath and that we could sit down, perhaps here, I don't even know if it needs to be in front of the full council, and dig into this thing and say, can we please understand where are we at in terms of our goals for economic benefit? Are we ahead? Are we behind? And then, so that's I guess what I would say, the tangible metric side of it. And then the second piece of it is, there may be three pieces, but one of them then is, okay, how does this all fit in with our growth goals and so on and so forth? You know, broadly, I think, you know, if you can't, to quote somebody, put up a wall to control growth, then focusing growth and doing it in a way that that is more efficient. My view is that the Downs accomplishes that. And so that's speaking to that. And then the third piece of it is, where are we on the live, work, play vision and so forth? And I think as a function of going through that and talking about the interaction of the TIF and the CEA, we can kind of come to the, using a practical example, come to answering some of those questions. And at the same time, meeting a need that people in the community seem to be saying, update us, we'd like to know what's going on. That's my take on. So as much as I'd like to hear the whole history, and I'll stop by your office again if it was.
I don't know if there's something specific within the Downs TIF that we had concerns over, but you did list off you listed off a laundry list of things that you wanted to see change, but I feel like some of them are working against each other. Because you're saying we're not able to use all of the TIF funds now, but then why would we be looking at boundary changes if I think we first need to address that issue, I guess. So I think I
Agreed.
want to prioritize.
Yeah, that's what.
So I want to
Yeah.
prioritize because I think we first need to address the fact that we are maybe reaching the end of being able to maximize the funds before we look at boundary changes in, I don't know if the affordable housing language is part of the CEA and affects the TIF. I just don't know. But I think when I look at that, I'm like, I feel like that's the biggest thing. Can you change the TIF to expand what you can use the funds for? Didn't we already do that once?
You can, we've got a fairly expansive almost, but there may be a few other areas we could consider further. We,
I don't know.
right out of the gate, we took almost as liberal a perspective as we possibly could.
And then
And
we're still.
in part because it's a financial juggernaut. It's producing so much and it will in the future start to throw off so much at 100% capture that I think we will be challenged. You know, a community center or major transportation projects or even a school would certainly satisfy that concern.
I kind of like, I like what you said and I like what he said, and I almost feel like the way we tackle this may be first revisiting the analysis, the TIF benefit, the current, what's happening in the TIF district financially, to then inform the conversation of, do we need to change our capture? Do we need to change the TIF program? And I like what you said though, of like, part of the end goal of this though, is once we've kind of understood stuff, gotten the story, then we invite the developer to come have a joint workshop like they were obligated to do, but are no longer obligated to do, to potentially come and share all of that with council, with the public, and say, look, we want to make sure you guys understand where we are. We had a goal. How are we performing to that goal? Where are we now? And as a result, we may need to change our TIF capture rate because we're collecting so much money. And maybe we'll have a recommendation at that point or not, or maybe it'll be, council, we need to start thinking about changes and how we're going to capture the TIF. So maybe, I think, just hearing this conversation and agreeing with you, like, we got to like have a clear pathway that makes sense. To me, it feels like starting with the analysis and looking at how the TIF is performing collectively. And then once that's all cleared up, then we start the conversation on TIF capture. The policy piece feels like the end of the, or like not even.
My only concern is we hopefully will have another affordable housing project in our community, and I will be shocked if they don't ask for CEA. So predict that we'll be back in that same dilemma sooner than later. I hope we are.
Mhm.
Saying, we got a policy, why aren't we following it? So Karen's done a lot of work and if you're willing, I think we'd like to take a stab at modifying that policy to carve out and create a separate set of standards. We're not saying, don't have standards for affordable housing, but they're different metrics than for
Yeah, I agree.
economic development. So if, with your permission, I think
Yeah.
we'd like to bring that to you sooner than later.
That's a quick win that you guys have already, okay.
And the other thing that I think is, what we're asking is if you're okay with it, basically the existing policy is a little, it goes back and forth, talking about TIF, then CEA, then TIF, and we just want to separate that out. We want to say, if you want a CEA, these are the things you need to come to us with and what you need to be thinking about. And all of that is in the policy. It's just a little bit
It's clunky.
clunky, thank you. I was
Agreed.
trying to be thinking of a different word. Yeah, so we just need to separate that out. And I think if we separate out all of the TIF discussion, which is really about what you guys want to do, that will help you have at least a slate to start with, to add some things that as a council, here are our goals with respect to TIFs. And then it leaves, we can separate the CEA, which just is really clear, like you need to be, addressing these objectives. If you're an affordable housing project, you need to do X, Y, and Z. And I think we can lay that out pretty easily,
Mhm.
and come back with you with a draft that would.
We can-
Okay. So maybe
I'd like
we,
to do that.
maybe at the next meeting. I
absolutely.
think it would be great at the next meeting if we could look at the TIF policy, and then I think also the Downs analysis and the TIF performance.
Mm.
Because I think understanding that those are really two parallel things that have different purposes, but I do like the idea of us getting to a point with the public where we can get back to them to say, we've revisited the Downs, the TIF. Here's our assessment of where we are, the benefits, the negatives that we may see. And where are we going and what are we projecting? I think that's an important
Would,
conversation.
would you permit us, just to give you a 30,000-foot kind of a check-in where we see it? And there's a ton of research and we'd love to dive deep to show you all the cost to serve piece that funnels into this, the revenue estimates and such, but it's a very compelling argument. And I certainly heard the commenter at your last meeting. I'm not sure what prompted that at this point. I think my sense was that commenter were saying, that's the elephant in the room and us taxpayers think it's a bad deal. And we owe it to them to tell them what the deal is. And I think should be pleasantly surprised
Yeah.
that it's actually a favorable deal.
When I think that's to me, both the capital plan piece and this
Mhm.
are us reacting to public feedback that we need a plan for spending. And there is a perception by many that they feel like the TIF wasn't a good deal and we have to and I don't think it was ever intended to be a good deal out the gate, meaning
No.
benefit is the 30 years, but I don't think we had projected data. Now we have real data.
Mhm.
They have a much more specific plan of what they're expecting. So I think
Right.
we can have more confidence in what we're putting out to say, this is what we really think. And so I think it's important that we use this opportunity.
Understandably, and I've been involved with many TIFs over the years, different communities, and people often can't get past the potential benefit to the developer. Obviously, when we're reimbursing taxes, there is benefit. The right question, the question we should be asking, is there benefit to us? And we should never even consider a project that isn't positive to us.
I think that is exactly right.
Mhm.
And that benefit needs to be reported consistently
Mhm.
over time.
And it's gonna get revised over time too.
What is getting reported consistently over time is driving through 8 corners and seeing, trees coming down and buildings
Right.
coming up and, so visually, people are getting a report which they align with whatever perceptions they happen to have with it, which I'm going to guess are not necessarily
Mhm.
positive. So they're getting a report every day.
Right.
Reinforcing
Experience.
through their experience. So
Mhm.
I think it really is incumbent on us
So
to do
Would you
that.
give us 10 minutes to just give you a high level and then?
Yeah, before we do that, can we get to the budget item, which I think
Oh,
will be
sure.
quick, just so that we can align on that, and I think we should have 2 minutes to do that. Are you? So for the budget, again, I think this Counselor Cushing wanted to make sure we have a brief conversation on, we had a really good retrospective at the last meeting. How are we taking that from a conversation to action? My recommendation is if we can align on like 3 things that we think are important. Counselor Cushing, I think, would be a great person to work directly with town staff more behind the scenes to come up with, you know, actual recommendations to bring back to the committee at a later date. So what I was hoping, if I'm seeing you shake your head, are you amenable to that? So if we can at least agree on like the 3 things that we think are important that Counselor Cushing explores with staff, if Tom, you're okay with that, then allow him and staff to work however long it takes, a couple months, whatever, to bring something back to this committee in terms of recommendations that are tangible. So anything top of mind, or like, I know you have very specific ideas that I'm supportive of.
The big one for me is how we present the budget and what information we present. My observation was we were answering tons of questions, and I had difficulty myself. The data was there, but when I'm looking at personnel costs, I gotta dig for how many FTEs we have. I have to
Mhm.
say, okay, how much of this is union? How much is non-union? How much is absolutely committed? How much is discretionary? How many positions are we bringing in? How many are we eliminating? Okay, I mean, I'm using those as an example because that's 80% of the nut right there. And so I think that there's a way to go from this is where we are to a precise definition of level services. I know we have a definition, but does that include a bumper for inflation, or, you know, so what is it, what's in there actually? And then we can begin to talk about what are the programmatic changes we get to from there.
Mhm.
And it feels to me like we can get to that at the top line level on a page in gross terms, and then we can consider the revenue, and then we can get to net.
Mhm.
So when I look at these financial statements, they are, it's like taking a business income statement, turning it upside down. Puts the expenses up here, puts the revenue down here, and then it gets to net. And the way that we present it is gross, net, so forth. And so, again, I don't pretend to know it all. What I'm really interested in is seeing how we can get to easily showing some of the fundamental things that
Mhm.
a taxpayer could look at and make some sense of.
Yeah, I agree with
That's-
that.
Okay, that's what I'm looking for.
Do you have a particular priority you'd like Counselor Cushing to explore?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the feedback I gave was very just elementary, like, you know, we need more time for presentations. Can we group the departments together? So if we're just talking about community services, we have everything together. But I mean, generally, I've been through 2 budget seasons and I think it was very good. And I think you guys do a great job. And
Mhm.
so I don't think I have any really in-depth feedback
Yeah.
beyond that.
So mine are, I support and agree with the one you said. The other piece that I know Liam and you have already started to discuss, or he shared some stuff, was what the former assistant town manager did that was intended to like create some simplified tools to communicate the budget as well. So I think there's like,
Yeah, I saw that, and I think Lee and I discussed that and saying that I think that once you get an underlying, more transparent foundation, then you can overlay communication tools on that enhance that.
yeah,
But to me, to not get to some of the fundamental stuff and put a communication overlay on top
Yeah.
of it feels like hand waving
yeah.
and
But I think that's gonna be super important
but
to have. So I think if you guys could just explore, assuming you get the foundation correct, what does that mean for some of those communication tools? And then the other piece that I would encourage you to explore too and ask that maybe you pull in Brayla, because she was pretty adamant about this in the workshop, was our goal setting and how do we jointly partner more with the board and understanding externalities to make sure we're setting a goal. And again, while I feel like we can set a goal and always change our minds, like it would be good if we can have some upfront alignment dialogue. I think historically, we've always either said it's a 3% mill rate. This year, we tried to set a goal. I think figuring out how we collaborate with them more in that goal setting would be a good thing to understand and maybe start that conversation early so that when we get into goal setting in January, maybe there's pre-meetings that happen beforehand with the board so that we can come up with something that makes sense and that we can all work with.
Yeah, I honestly, I think, I agree with you, and I think that what Kate did towards the end of the budget discussion was getting to, in a very specific way, around some of the things they were doing. You know, she had that sort of cascading, is what this is, now if we do this, now if we do this, and so you can follow that along. Essentially, I'm not sure that that thing would apply to, you know, the overall budget presentation, but conceptually, I think she had the right idea. And so, and with respect to, you know, the moving target, I think it's worth a discussion about the budget goal setting process. You know, I mean, that was my first one. And people said 5% net. And it was like, well, what can we afford? You know, that strikes me as a good place to begin. And if we really want this, there's some other things that we're willing to give up. I mean, as I'm listening to folks, and you know, again, I don't have a giant constituency, but when I respond and explain this, they say, well, that makes sense to me. Yeah, I can deal with that. That would make me feel like this conversation has some basis in my reality.
I think maybe that's what I'm suggesting is like,
Yeah.
Is there a better budget goal setting process that we should be considering? And to what extent does that incorporate collaboration with the board to do so? Because again, like I'm just already knowing next year, the teacher salary contract is coming up. And so we can anticipate changes to the budget next year, just resultant of that, which may get us at a 3% mill rate with no spend anywhere else.
Right.
So again, that's where I feel like that's an important thing we need to figure out and align on up front to then say, okay, knowing some of these big things. And then again, we also talked about like, what if there's legislation at the state that's going to have some significant impact? Like, how do we want to consider that in our goal setting? So that way we're being clear up front, like what we're anticipating and how that may change how we set a goal.
It's interesting that you say that, especially in terms of public engagement. So in other words, as you begin to know these things, okay? So what's coming up, folks? Before we've set any goals, here are the things. If we're going to have a public forum to discuss budget, we can say, here's what our reality is today. How would you deal with that reality? Okay, and God knows we may get some good ideas. We might make people feel better because they had a chance to participate, as opposed to commenting on an existing budget. Come and tell us where you think the priorities are, where you think we should look to become more conservative and so forth.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with that we should try in this process to get to anticipate everything we can that is baked in, and then be able to present this reality in terms of the things we'd like to accomplish, because we'll have to set some priorities and choose some things over others.
Yeah.
Just a historical, or I should say, my perspective on goal setting and collaborating with the Board of Education. We've almost always done that, and I will not speak for the current board, but my experience with working with past boards is that they're part of the conversation, but reluctantly, and they don't offer much because the reality is they'd rather not have a goal. The frustration really is when we change that goal.
Yeah.
Right? All right, we started with this and we met it and their hands are folded and then all of a sudden the goalposts change. And sometimes for very good reasons, other times for political reasons, whatever it might be. So that the frustration is around the changing of the goal from the start to the finish.
But I feel like we didn't, this year especially, like, I think. I don't know if we knew enough when we set the goals, that.
That's
that
true.
Unfortunately, there were some unknown unknowns.
Yeah, that's true.
But again, if at a minimum, we can get at the known knowns in collaboration to say, here's what we know that's gonna happen. And make sure that the public understands that and then get the public's help. Again, when there's unknowns that come up, like, the unfortunate reality is we're just gonna have to.
Right.
react.
Councilor Anderson, are you quoting Donald Rumsfeld here?
I don't know, am I?
I think you did. Yeah.
Unknowingly? I don't remember the exact quote, but I think you did it.
I know, like, I mean, I think that part of the problem though is it's an expectation problem. And there are things that evolve through a budget process. I mean, we start our budget process 5 months before our current fiscal year is closed. So we're trying to anticipate expenses and other variables that are at that point 17 months away. And so I think one of the other observations I've made is that, and this isn't a slight against the BOE, but they start their process even earlier than that. And so those unknown unknowns are even more challenging. And so I think that one other observation I think is that everyone should have an expectation that there are things that are going to be fluid in the budget process.
Yeah.
And it's going to change. And so rather than fight against it and try to look at the process, it's just suggest we have to fine tune it. I think just having an expectation that this is going to be fluid. There are going to be moving goalposts as things like revals become more clear as to what the impact is. So rather than begrudge that, just change the expectation to accept that and move the
Yeah.
process perspective.
That's how I always looked at it. And again, but I appreciate though their perspective and want to make sure that at least aligning on the known things. And I like the idea of your point of, is there a point before we even set a goal that we engage the public to say, hey, here's what we know that's coming. Again, we can't predict the future, so we're about to set a goal, give us feedback so then we can use that to set a goal. And then, again, to your point, there's gonna have to be some flexibility about those unknowns that come up throughout the process, unfortunately.
Okay.
So you have three things, what you suggested, what we just talked about in terms of goal process, and then again, maybe the communications overlay of the foundation work that you would like to see. So if you can take that on, work with staff and come back to us whenever you're ready. I think that would be good to kind of let you guys kind of work through that. All right, so we still have time, so 10 minutes, we can circle back to.
Can you go to the end of the packet? There's a nice colorful sheet like that.
And so while he's pulling that up, I'm just gonna say, you can think of this as another step toward finalizing the numbers. And I say that because right now, what I did to change this from the last time we looked at it is two things. One, I took out the marginal cost options for the schools, and it's 100% of the school costs in this. So that's why cost to serve has gone up from the last time you saw it. I also went in and corrected the current year 6 projection. So I put in 1105 for the tax rate. It's still estimated. We won't know until, August for sure. 1105. And, I changed the budget number to conform to the 4.21% increase. So that changed everything a little bit, reset the tax rates. I also went ahead and increased the annual increase of the department budgets. I had them at 4%. I did just push it up to 5%. I'll look at that again. I don't have the current the new budget numbers for the departments. I haven't factored that in. So that's will be the next step is we need to go back and look at the final numbers for
So there could
departments.
be a deep dive on both sides of this model, but what is rolled up here, the takeaway I want to leave you with is that we now have 5 years' experience.
Yep.
Karen's did a model that projects, captures the value that's created in the first 5 years and then projects value over the next 25. And similarly, it does the same thing on the cost side. And there's a lot of different inputs for each of those to roll them up. And Liam, if you could blow it up and really focus on that bottom blue, the bottom right hand. I think that's where it all comes together, right, Karen?
Right. And so this is the, you might be looking at the older one, the previous one.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Can you see it on the screen?
So I downloaded the packet online
I
and I
just
see
always
it.
get nervous. when-
right. So this is, the addition to this is, what you hadn't seen before, is I hadn't done a cumulative. I did year 30, but that's what's happening in year 30. It wasn't a cumulative summary of the impact over the 30 years of the TIF. And so what we're really saying is, cumulative revenues over the 30 years, about 485 million. The CEA obligation is 81.3.
You heard that number from the podium, which is something we knew at the inception of this, that was their potential if they met their expectations of value creation.
Right?
Number is even in my small.
Yeah.
And that doesn't change because we've capped them. They reach a bonus period, and so it doesn't continue to be a 40%. It's capped at 2 million per year in the last 10 years.
But what about the bonus payment that they get?
That's the 2 million. If it drops down.
The only way that will change is if they reach their bonus earlier than we thought, and I think we have them reaching it at year 18. So they're in the $80 million range if they continue to build out as they have and as we expect.
Right. So yeah, 55 million is that trigger. When they hit 55 million, then I have to go back in and say, nope, you're not getting 40% anymore. You're getting the 10.
You fall back.
And then if that 10% exceeds $2 million, then I cap the 10% and bring it back down to 2 million.
Yeah.
So, and that's the change. And so that's why over time, over the 30-year period, that CEA obligation is about 17% of the entire revenues that are
But
generated.
let's not just gloss over the numbers. So value created approaching 500 million, or excuse me, revenues approaching 500 million, paying them out about 82 million potentially. We expect it's going to cost us about 285 million to provide services
throughout
to
those 30 years?
all the new development, the needs of those that exist there.
And have 120 million.
120 lift, that's the ROI. That's
Right.
the positive to us. And
Cumulative.
remember, the premise to all of this is the but for a TIF. So I would argue that what we see happening there today would not be happening without us agreeing, without assuming any risk and making any investment to return some percentage of value that they create and taxes they pay. So it could be argued that none of this would exist without us being a financial partner and them assuming the risk. And the thing that I'm most really surprised by is what percentage the CEA obligation is as a percentage of revenues. It ends up being, under 17%. And I know what's stuck in everyone's mind is it's a 40% reimbursement, but it's complicated
Yeah.
with all the different
Right.
mechanisms.
And if they hit it earlier, then they drop down earlier.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and I think maybe one of the education pieces in the future is when I look at the blue chart above the top one,
Mhm.
like it takes time to accumulate that benefit. So out the gate, there may not be a benefit. A lot of people who are looking 5 years, 10 years down the road aren't going to see it. But this was a 30-year agreement and investment, not a 5-year
Mhm.
agreement and investment. So I think that's important.
In the long run, generates a profit. which
Yeah.
is huge.
And
I
even,
want this to be on tape here. It generates a profit on average of $4 million a year. Now, early on, it's like any other investment, it starts to pay off over the long term. I would say that if you look at it, you know, from a very simplistic point of view, is you go into a deal with somebody and they benefit maybe a lot, and you benefit a lot. Now, you can argue about whether or not you should have benefited more or they should have, you know, what do they say? Little pigs get fed, big pigs get slaughtered. And so, I mean, I think that, you know, that's what it distills at. And the more that that message comes down and say, well, what's that mean to me? What's $4 million a year mean to me in terms of my tax rate? Where would we be without the downs?
So I think there's also I think that's important, what would the tax rate look like with this and without it, so that we could at least communicate that.
Actually, I have that.
And
Yeah.
so I think that would be good. I also though think like the TIF CEA, definitely there's a big perception around the financial benefit that we need to educate, understand better. But I also think there's people just didn't want
Right.
more development in housing that we also have to like address too in the conversation.
Cost.
Yeah, it's not a
Second.
financial cost, but it's another cost that the community has kind of also kind of expressed concern. And so that's where I think we need the developer to be part of this conversation too, to say, you know, to your point, you were saying like we wanted this live, work, play. I think they're at the beginning of a lot of the play, which is what most people would benefit from. Clearly, there's a lot of residents who live there now who benefit from the live, and a lot of businesses that
There's
benefit from the work.
Well, I
But the
think
play is the piece that I
they
feel
can get a
like people-
restaurant open
Yeah.
until 10 o'clock.
Right.
I mean, let's face it, there's nothing in there. I guess Costco might be the exception, but there's nothing in there for the rest of Scarborough residents. And you're right, I think they're at the doorstep of this next important phase. I was talking to Autumn Spear, the planning director. The Downs team is actively involved with looking at that town center further refining it. Councilor Anderson and myself sat on a downtown committee that shared some views, and let's hope that some of those recommendations we actually see materialize. But I think to that end, they want to arrange a planning board site walk. And I suggested that we should extend that invitation to members of the council, so you can start to see in the field what their vision is, where it's going to be, and so I'll make you aware when that happens. I think it's going to be sometime in the next month or so.
That'd be good. So do we still need to double click more into the model, like at a next meeting? I think this was a good overview, but do you guys want to
There's a ton there.
Well,
make sure we, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm satisfied with it because I understand the process of you getting there. That it's based on assumptions that you have to make. My sense of it is that they're reasonable assumptions and we could, but I think that it's worthwhile digging in a little deeper on the assumption side of it, because people who are baked in on this will say, well, you know, those are just made up numbers.
Well,
And
certain amount of truth in that, but
well,
they're based on
certainly.
something.
I mean, anything, you know, ask me what I'm having for breakfast tomorrow, and that's a made up number. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the future. I don't know what's gonna
Okay.
happen. So,
Right.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think it'd be worthwhile to get into it a little deeper, to understand its impact on the.
So next meeting, we could
Next meeting.
focus on assumptions.
I think focus on assumptions and also focus on the TIF
Right, the draft, yeah.
recommendations. Is there anything else, anything, Counselor Shupe, you want to add to this particular? Anything else you want to see on the next agenda?
I'd only want to be here for an hour and a half.
Okay. Good,
Good.
okay. All right.
John, I would say, the other thing that we'll have by then is, you know, we have the new data set in place. And so I'll be able to ground truth some of the assumptions that we're making about what's population at the Downs, population and employment at the Downs. So that'll be really helpful to see whether or not, how off our estimates are.
Okay. And I'm happy to work with staff. Maybe this is just something to include in the packet, but not have on the agenda. Whatever this multi-year plan looks like for capital, how we want to approach that, to just put a recommendation out. Maybe we won't have time to have it on the agenda and discuss it, but we can at least have it there and hopefully at least have a couple near-term steps outlined that
Mhm.
are generally amenable, but we can look at the broader plan at a different meeting. All right, with that, last item is public comment. So is there anybody in the public who would like to comment?
Jim Pritchard, Maple Ave. I wasn't gonna speak. But as listening to the conversations on the fund balance, the word stuck out to me, may. I hate that word. I spent 7 days on an arbitration errand, and 5 of the 7 days was debating the word may. I hope we can find another word to use other than may. May means will. What's the difference between will and must? If you want the flexibility, I hope we can find another word other than may. Because that may goes to interpretation.
Mhm.
What I think it means may be different than what the 3 of you think, or what the 3 administration think. It ends up in confrontation.
Mhm.
The other thing that I'd like to bring up is the capital projects. Is there a line in that for catastrophe? We have a microburst. It takes the roof off from the portables in the school. That's a lot of money
Mhm.
to replace those. Is there a line for that? And how does it affect the 5 million?
Mhm. Are those the type of things that the vulnerability assessment might help us kind of identify, like where we have?
That example, I don't think will come through the vulnerability assessment, but you know, that scenario would be an insured situations.
Okay.
But
It would,
I would expect so, yes.
even with
but-
the deductible?
Yeah, deductible will be a veritable drop in the bucket if we're replacing, but your point's well taken. I'm not sure how to plan for the unknown in a capital plan over a fixed time, but I think that goes back to having a resilient and strong fund balance, that we have resources to bring to bear when needed, if needed.
So that's why we need to get to the 16.6%.
I do have other questions on fund balance being used in the budget along with TIF. But I'll submit the questions in writing, then you and I can have a conversation.
That sounds great. Let's do that. Awesome. All right, anybody else in the public who'd like to comment? No? All right, with that, can I get a motion to adjourn?
So
Second.
All in favor? All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you.